Wildfire Research Group. Um, and this seminar is organized by Michael Gollner from UC Berkeley, Crystal Colden from UC Merced, and myself, Janet Cobian-Iñiguez, also from UC Merced. Today, we are pleased to be welcoming our speaker, Dr. Asmeret Berhe from the University of California, Merced. Before I begin, I have a series of announcements to make. So for today, the seminar talk will take place during the first hour of this meeting. During this hour, participants are able to ask questions through the Q&A box of Zoom. Questions will be answered at the end of the talk in the order in which they're received. Following the talk, we will be hosting an extended discussion during a separate Zoom link. Everyone is invited to attend the discussion hour. Students and early career folks are highly encouraged to join. A link to the discussion session will be posted in the chat during our seminar today. And without further delay, allow me to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Berhe is Professor of Soil Biochemistry and Velasco Chair in Earth Sciences at the Department of Life and Environmental Sciences at UC Merced. She is also the Interim Associate Dean of Graduate Education at UCM. Dr. Berhe's research focuses on biogeochemical cycling in the soil system, global change science, nanogeochemistry, and political ecology of land degradation and ownership. She has a PhD in biochemistry from UC Berkeley, a master's from Michigan State University, and a bachelor's from University of Asmeret, Eritrea. She completed a postdoc through the University of California Presidential Postdoctoral Fellowship at UC Berkeley and UC Davis. Dr. Berhe is recipient of multiple awards and honors and has served on numerous committees. She is the past chair of the U.S. National Committee on Soil Science at the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. She is an associate editor of AGU's Journal of Geophysical Research, and she received the NSF Career Award, the Fellow and Bromley Award from the Geological Society of America, and is a member of the United States Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, New Voices in Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Without further delay, join me in welcoming Dr. Berhe. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeanette, for that generous introduction. Thank you also, Michael and Crystal, for the invitation. I'm really excited to join you all today. I'm so excited that you're all part of UC and we get to have a bit more interaction going forward, at least I hope when this crazy year is over. But today I'll tell you all a little bit about the kind of work that we do in my lab, in particular, ones that have to do with fire. And when it comes to the impact of fire, one of the questions that we've been asking is the implication of fires on increasing erosion after the fire events end, and how those erosion events then affect the persistence of fire-altered or pyrogenic carbon in soil. Before I start, I want to give due credit to both two students and a postdoc that have worked in my lab and are responsible for a lot of the data that I'm going to show you in a bit. And so this would not be possible without Rebecca Abney, Samuel Araya, and Fernanda Santos. They should get all the credit for the awesome work. But we've also been fortunate to work with a lot of other collaborators, some colleagues at UC Merced and outside UC Merced, and received generous funding from multiple organizations to enable us to do this work. Okay, so I figured since I don't know many of you very well, I should start by telling you a little bit about the kind of work that we do in my lab. So we're a biogeochemistry lab. And we try to be a kind of lab that's guided by principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we ask questions about how physical change in the environment, in particular, rapid physical change that occurs as a function of erosion, as a result of erosion, fire, or even changing global change variables, including climate change that have to do with temperature or precipitation. how those affect the rate of biogeochemical cycling of essential elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Lately, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about a specific pool of carbon, that fire-altered pool of carbon that I mentioned, pyrogenic carbon, too. And we've asked a lot of questions that have to do with redistribution, vertical movement of soil and associated soil organic matter down the soil profile, as well as lateral transport of these materials across land surfaces within the terrestrial ecosystem, as well as transfer from terrestrial to aquatic systems. And this will obviously be the focus of my talk today too. And we've spent a lot of time in my lab asking questions about nanobiogeochemistry, meaning we're asking questions about how natural but reactive metal oxides in soil, how they regulate dynamics of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling in the soil system. And then at the larger scale, we've asked a lot of questions, and this has grown in its the importance it's taking in our lab's work. Questions around this dynamic two-way relationship between human communities and the soil system that we depend on for pretty much most of our life's need, when it comes to feed, food, and other resources. And in particular, what happens when use and abuse and overuse of the soil resource causes large-scale degradation in the world soils, and its implication then for human livelihood and even national security type of considerations. And we've tried to use a political ecology framework for this work, which is basically a framework that uses political economic theory to understand relationship of human beings with their environment. So there's a lot going on. I'm fortunate to work with a dynamic group of early career scholars in this work. And because the focus today will be pyrogenic carbon and its transport and persistence in the soil system, I thought I should start by telling you what I mean by that. You would have heard about this pool of carbon referred to as either pyrogenic carbon or black carbon or pyrogenic matter, char, or ash. Basically, these are most of the time referring to a continuing of materials that are basically products of incomplete combustion of biomass. And you could see that, for example, in the bottom left corner of the screen here. And what you see here basically is that depending on the combustion conditions, the material's composition can be different. But generally speaking, once it gets to the level of char and ash, it means this material is dominantly made out of crystalline graphene-like sheets that are made out of condensed aromatic structures. So what we're referring to here basically is that it's made out of compounds that have this aromatic benzene ring, but depending on the temperature conditions at which the material is combusted, the biomass is combusted, you can have different number of these rings that are attached to one another. So the higher the temperature of combustion, for example, or pyrolysis, the larger the number of rings that we're typically find in this material. And oops, I don't know why it went to the opposite direction. The larger number of rings indicate that more condensed aromatic structures than less condensed aromatic structures that will have fewer number of rings. And when they're put together in graphene-like sheets. And when you put them together in 3D, then they form these structures that are very light, but are also porous. So they have a lot of pore structures in between, which is part of the reason why pyrogenic matter then tends to have high specific surface area for volume ratio is what we're talking about. And it also tends to be highly reactive, high pH typically material. And it's also, we're finding more and more that it's a pretty common pool of carbon. So as multiple studies have shown at this point, soon after fires, if you were to look into what proportion of the carbon in soil is made out of this carbon or pyrogenic carbon pool, you typically end up with numbers that are close to 60%. So 60% of the carbon in topsoil after fires could be this pyrogenic carbon material. And then overall, when people have tried to estimate the overall dominance of this pool or proportion in the global carbon cycle, we find that somewhere between 13 to 35% of all the carbon in the world's soils could be fire altered or pyrogenic. And this is important because what this means is if a lot of the carbon in the world's soils is actually made out of these condensed aromatic structures, then potentially we have been overestimating how fast carbon cycles in the soil system, because we know that these specific structures are relatively slow to break down compared to fresh cellulosic, more vegetation derived carbon that is not fire altered. And so this has opened up a lot of interesting questions in the soil biogeochemistry world. Okay, so to come to things that you all, I assume, know, so I'll try to zoom through this quite quickly, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Obviously, the amount of fires and the number of fires that have happened, in particular in the western part of the US, has been increasing at a fast rate and now covers quite large areas. We also know that fire is a global controller of soil carbon dynamics, so not just in the Western US or in relatively dry systems, but in many parts of the world, there tends to be quite a significant amount of fire that happens, and that is associated with somewhere close to 2.2 petagrams of carbon emissions to the atmosphere, and there's estimates that 6% of the global fossil, the net greenhouse gas fluxes from fire could be equivalent to roughly about 6% of the global fossil fuel CO2 emissions. And in the Western US, the rapidly increasing intensity of and coverage of fires has also been leading to large amounts of CO2 release to the atmosphere. I assume everyone here also agrees that this trend of fires getting larger and lasting longer, and the wildfire season extending for long periods of time has been going on for a while at this point, at least in the last few decades. And we've also seen that the climate change related increase in fuel aridity is also related to this increase in forest fire area. So, okay, so I don't think I told you what you didn't know so far. What I want to make sure we focus on, though, is that when a lot of times wildland fires and their effects in ecosystems is discussed in the literature, we tend to hear a lot about how wildfires caused, kind of combustion of above ground vegetation, and the even release of some particulate matter into the atmosphere as a result. Obviously, we hear about the property loss or threat to property and human lives, but we don't typically hear of a range of other variables associated with soil, and I want us to focus on that for today. First of all, when forest fires do happen, wildland fires in general, when they do happen, they cause loss of a lot of carbon from topsoils, carbon that would have been in the duff organic layer on top of the mineral soil horizons. And even if the soils didn't have an organic horizon, the carbon that's associated with the very top layers of soil, the nitrogen that's in those layers and phosphorus tends to be lost, and some of it tends to be transformed. And some of that combusted biomass is converted into pyrogenic matter, these fire altered carbon that I already discussed. And it's deposited on top of the soil surface in different sizes and different types of materials even. Obviously, there's a color difference here on the bottom that's meant to highlight that depending on fire severity, you can either lead to formation of char, so the dark black material that typically is created in low and medium severity fires, but if the fires are burning at really high temperatures, they also form the white ash material. You also know that once the biomass is burning, it releases large amounts of carbon dioxide as well as particulate black carbon into the atmosphere. And you see the patterns here at the global level, the black carbon release into the atmosphere, as well as the release of CO2 from California wildfires that happened in the time between 2003 and 2007 in the gray bars, and the high emissions that were observed in 2018 in red. So whenever we have these high intensity fires, they tend to be accompanied with large amounts of CO2 and atmospheric black carbon release. In addition, fires also cause important alterations to soil physical and chemical properties. In particular, they cause breakdown of aggregates. They cause instability in soil physical stability. They cause formation of hydrophobicity or reduced wettability of the soil surface, which have implications for wetting of the soil as well as for increasing erosion. And I want to take a moment to explain what I mean here. So typically speaking, when fires happen, even at low temperatures, some weeks and a couple of months or so after the fire, people tend to observe structural weakness of the soil and topsoil layers. And for a long time, it was not clear what was happening, but I'm going to show you some study that we've done at UC Merced in collaboration with folks at the Desert Research Institute in Nevada that highlights that this is a product of physical breakdown of the aggregates or the mineral and organic assemblages in soil that form clods. So the physical breakdown happens typically when, in particular, if fires happen when there's a little bit of moisture trapped within aggregates, then even if the fire temperature is not high enough to cause combustion of organic matter, which is how aggregates can break down at high temperature fires, but even at low temperature, when you do not have enough energy input from the fire to combust the organic matter holding the aggregates together, you could have enough heating of the moisture that's inside the aggregates to cause vapor pressure buildup that actually causes the aggregates to slowly break down. And that has been associated with increased erosion. In addition, the other variable that is associated with increased erosion post-fire is also the fact that when vegetation burns, it releases volatile organic compounds into the atmosphere. And some of those volatile organic compounds come back, return to the surface, and they tend to condense on cooled soil mineral surfaces. And this typically happens really near the top of the soil profile. And if there's a lot of these volatile organic compounds covering the soil surface, then the soil becomes hard to wet, or it resists wetting and downward infiltration of water. Typically, it seals it, is what we're talking about. We're talking about these typically lipids that cause sealing of the soil surface. And if water, especially in steep hill slopes, such as in the Sierra Nevada, if fire cannot, in post-fire conditions, if water from rainfall cannot penetrate vertically down the soil profile, then it has to move laterally. And when it moves laterally, it takes a lot of topsoil and associated carbon with it. And the figure that I'm showing you here the figure that I'm showing you right here at the bottom left corner of the screen is actually in soils that burned 10 years ago when we visited them here at the site of the Gondola fire in South Lake Tahoe. And we were trying to go around and test how, if the hydrophobicity that developed when the fire was, occurred in that area 10 years prior to our visit was persistent. And we kept doing this in site after site, and it kept observing basically the ponding of water. And for those of you who don't know this area and the soils, so the soils in this area are poorly weathered, very sandy, very porous. So there's no reason why water should not vertically move downward, and there's no reason why it shouldn't infiltrate very, very easily in this area. But when you pour water in this case, it just sits there. It sits there as an evidence for how long that hydrophobicity buildup affects the soil conditions going forward. We put a lot of this together in a review that my student Rebecca Abney and I put out a couple of years ago now, to basically highlight that there are multiple mechanisms at play for how post-fire erosion contributes to large amounts of particulate and dissolved pyrogenic carbon transport post-fire. So to sum up, what we've discussed is that in a pre-fire or when there's no fire conditions, in these kinds of ecosystems in the Sierra Nevada, you have steep hill slopes dominated by forests. And when rainfall does occur, most of the water moves vertically downward. And that's, in fact, it moves laterally to streams through subsurface flow mechanisms, which is what you expect them to do. But fire changed this hydrologic flow regime quite significantly because, first of all, it eliminates the vegetation cover. So when rainfall occurs, then the kinetic energy of raindrops hits the surface strongly, right? Because there's no vegetation to slow it down. In addition, the surface has now also experienced hydrophobicity, like I showed you in that picture earlier. So the water cannot easily mobilize, it can't move down the soil profile. So instead, it moves laterally, but it now laterally moves on the soil surface. So as a result, it's not only just the water that moves, but it also takes a lot of soil with it. And even along with the soil, it takes a lot of this pyrogenic matter that is sitting on the soil surface post-fire along with it. And this has been observed repeatedly when hydrologists and geomorphologists follow on to see how fire affects hydrologic flow regimes and erosion. And this is typically what they observe. This is a picture taken from the Hayman fire in Colorado by Lee McDonald, somebody who's worked on post-fire erosion for long, long periods of time. And to basically highlight that post-fire, the first major rainfall events typically transport this black material that is rich in pyrogenic carbon. And there's a lot of interesting questions that I'm going to show you we ask about biogeochemical implications of this. But I just want to take a pause and mention that there's a huge environmental health issue associated with this too. And part of this is that if post-fire erosion increases in ecosystems that are affected by fires, it means a lot of sediment, a lot of carbon, and a lot of pyrogenic carbon is entering streams and thereby reservoirs and lakes and similar aquatic systems. And this poses interesting health challenge, an important health challenge for water quality in particular. And because if a lot of this extra sediment and carbon is showing up in reservoirs, then the municipalities will have to try to clean the water before they deliver it to their customers. And one of the popular mechanisms and things they do is to treat the water with chlorine, right, which is a common chemical that they use. But addition of chlorine in systems that now have a lot of sediment and carbon tends to cause formation of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which some of them have been shown to be carcinogenic. So beyond the biogeochemical implications that I'm talking about here, there's a very interesting environmental health angle why people are interested in post-fire erosion. So to go back to the biogeochemistry though, I like this figure because this is one of the earlier attempts to put together a global pyrogenic carbon cycle budget. There's a better one by Michael Bird, if that's an interest for you all, that was published in Annual Reviews. But I like this one because it highlights what we don't know very well. And so, we all know that when biomass burns, it forms pyrogenic carbon. Study after study has documented large stocks of pyrogenic carbon in soil. Many studies have also documented that pyrogenic carbon is released into the atmosphere in the form of soot or black carbon, and a lot of it even returns with wet and dry deposition. Multiple other studies have also documented that there's a lot of pyrogenic carbon in marine sediments in particular. But in between, we lack a very good understanding of the mechanisms by which lateral transport of pyrogenic carbon happens. We lack very good understanding of what mechanism is it actually getting transported at. Is it moving in dissolved phase, in particulate phase? What are the main dominant variables that control its transport? So all of these are basically question marks. The authors of this paper put the red question marks, actually. They highlighted kind of the importance of the work that we were doing quite nicely for us. And so to answer a few of those questions and the question marks, then I'm going to tell you some work that we've done. First of all, we'll start with very simple results from laboratory burning experiments, heating experiments, basically, that we've done to determine how fires alter soil organic matter. And I put fires in quotation marks here because all we did is put soils in furnaces to see how that exposure to high temperature affects soil conditions. This by no means is translatable one-in-one to what happens in fires out there, but it is kind of one of the best things we could do to estimate the effect of different temperatures, exposure, and different intensity fires, if you will. So we'll talk about the effect on particulate organic matter as well as water-extractable organic matter and dissolved organic matter. And then we'll talk about what variables tend to be the ones that play major role in post-fire erosion, as well as post-fire transport of sediments and pyrogenic carbon. And specifically, we'll ask questions about the role that slope of the landscape or geomorphology versus fire conditions, and specifically severity play in transport of Pi-C post-fire. And then we'll get into questions of whether Pi-C is selectively transported by erosion. And if it is, then how it affects our ability to estimate the mean residence time or persistence of pyrogenic carbon in the Earth system. I'll start with the lab experiments. So when we wanted to do this lab experiments, we first wanted to get our hands on soils that are very diverse. We wanted soils that have different amount of carbon, different type of mineralogy, different types of clay, different potential to form aggregates. And you know, we located in the Central Valley of California, right next to the Sierra Nevada. So thankfully, we didn't have to go very far to find soils that fulfill these criteria. We work with Randy Dahlgren, who's a pedologist who just recently retired from UC Davis, to retrace sites that he's worked on and characterized very well. And so my student, Samuel Nguse Araya, and I retraced those sites, collected those samples again, and we brought them back into the lab. And then to test the conditions that we wanted to ask about fire, then we also put the soils, we decided to try and mimic what people observe in fires. And we use this fairly early study at this point as a guide for how to decide what temperature conditions we should be doing this experiment. And for those of you who might not have seen this, what this is basically a data from what happens during wildland fires when fires start and the temperature conditions start peaking up ground. So right at the contact of the mineral surface soil with the atmosphere versus a different soil depths. And as you could see, obviously the temperature peaks up right, quite readily, quickly, right when you're right on the top of the soil surface. But if you go deeper into the soil, even 2.5 centimeters or 5 centimeters, obviously the peak temperature is delayed, but also the peak temperature that it reaches is also considerably lower than what you see on the soil surface. And this is particularly because soil is a particularly poor conductor of heat. In fact, the only time that soil conducts heat rather readily is if it's wet. And if it's wet, there's a lot of water, then it could can transfer that heat quite readily to deeper soil layers, but dry soil typically doesn't. So we decided, okay, this is a good guide. This reached about 700. This was stuck at about 100, right, at 5 centimeters. So we collected soils from the top 5 centimeters and we stuck them in the furnace for anywhere from 150 centigrades to 650 degrees centigrades. And the 25 centimeter here is the unaltered control. So one of the ways I want you to focus is that there's a lot of data here, but the whole point is, remember, these soils are very diverse. They have different amounts of, clay, different amount of carbon, different type of biomass that they supported along this western slope of the Sierra Nevada climal sequence. But what's important is that once you see the pattern, though, the way they respond in terms of how much carbon gets lost when they're exposed to these temperature conditions, that pattern is very consistent, regardless of where you start in terms of carbon. So for example, if you started with this music soil, which has the highest carbon content, that averages about 7.5 or so, you see that as soon as it's exposed to 150 to 150, it starts losing carbon. But then between 250 and 450, all of them lose quite a lot of carbon, and they lose it fast, right? And so the fastest rate of loss is associated with that temperature range. And by the time we expose the soils to 450 degrees centigrades, all the soils, regardless of what they started and their physical and chemical properties, also lose about 95% of the carbon they started out with. None of this is necessarily, kind of surprising, but it's useful in helping understand the questions that I'm going to answer in a bit. Okay, so the next question that we wanted to ask is, remember, we asked questions about why does soil become easy to transfer after fires, easy to erode, basically. And one of the hypotheses that we've had is that aggregates get weakened. And remember, aggregates in soil are held together by organic matter, by fungal hyphae, in especially larger aggregates, but also some of them are basically glued together by binding agents that might involve carbon and other polyvalent cations. And so when we expose these soils to different temperatures, and then we try to measure the proportion of water-stable aggregates, so the aggregates that resisted break-in, basically, under exposure of that heat, we see something similar, right? The zone of weakness seems to be still between 250 and 450. In particular, the 250 to 350 range in some soils was pretty important. In particular, if you see at this high temperature range. And this was particularly true in the high elevation soils, which seem to be very susceptible to losing large amounts of carbon and aggregate destabilization at high temperature. But we also noticed that the response in the low temperature range before 250 in particular, but especially up to 150, is very different than the response afterwards. And that has to do with that mechanism that I discussed, right? If there is aggregate breakdown happening in that early phase before 250 degrees centigrades, it tends to be associated with the vapor pressure buildup inside the aggregates in soil that causes the weakening of aggregates. I'm not going to go too much into that, but that was covered in this paper, Jian et al. That we published in Frontiers in Earth Sciences a couple of years ago now. And so there's two distinct mechanisms by how aggregates are breaking down that we're seeing. At high temperature, it seems to be associated with the loss of carbon that occurs in particular past the 250 degrees centigrade range, between 250 and 450. But before that, it tends to be associated, if it occurs, it's associated with this weakened aggregates because of vapor pressure buildup that causes disaggregation. And we also wanted to know, so whatever carbon is left until the 450, if we were to go deep and ask questions about where is that carbon, where do we find it? So to back up a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with what we're doing here, so carbon in soil exists, generally speaking, in three distinct pools. There's one pool of carbon that's made out of particulate organic matter. So these pieces of plant and animal remains that are in different stages of decomposition, those cycle rather quickly at an annual time scale or so in soil. But then there is carbon that's associated with minerals. One pool of carbon is associated with minerals physically, meaning it is physically trapped inside aggregate spaces. And that makes it hard for microbes to break it down, because to be able to get access to that carbon that's inside aggregates is obviously non-trivial energy expenditure that's needed. And so because aggregation basically physically occludes carbon, it protects access to microbes and also limits diffusion of water and enzymes that are needed for breaking down of that organic matter. Carbon that finds itself in those aggregates tend to be preserved for long periods of time. There's a third pool of carbon that is bound to the surfaces of chemicals in soil. In particular, it's bound to the surfaces of fine particles, i.e. the clay and the fine silt size range particles. And so we wanted to see, if you use that as an analogy, so this is the macro aggregates that are held together by a lot of particular organic matter associated with this pool, and then the very small, relatively more stable aggregates that are less than 250 micron in size. And this pool, the very dark one, silt and clay size, is referring to the less than 53 micron size particles. Hence, all the carbon that's associated in the silt and clay size is bound to be the bound to mineral surfaces, so the chemically stabilized pool of carbon. Carbon that is in the microaggregate is dominantly going to be physically stabilized by aggregation, but some of it could also be in this organomineral associations with clay and silt particles. And so what you quickly notice is that when you do the separation of carbon into these three pools, you notice a couple of things. First of all, we didn't do this separation, which is a very time-intensive technique on the soils exposed to 550 and 650 degrees C temperatures, because remember, we lost 95% of the carbon at that point, and there was really no point in doing that. Everything that's lost is going to be associated with the silt and clay sized particles. So we took that out. But what you notice quickly in these soils afterwards is that you see, again, quite interesting change, in particular loss of carbon that is associated with the large aggregates in the particulate pool, the macro aggregate, right? So by the time you pass 350 and get to 450, anywhere from about 75 or something, anywhere from about 65 to 75% of the carbon that remains in soil is associated with minerals in either the micro or the silt and clay sized particles. So pretty much majority of that carbon remaining after exposure to fire in the very top soils that are exposed to heat is going to be associated with this mineral associated pools that are going to be persistent in soil. Everything that could burn or could be exposed is gone, basically, is what the message is. Okay, so then we ask questions about, does exposure to heat alter the nature and amount of carbon that is leached out of soil? So the carbon that is transported in dissolved form is what we're talking about. But to be able to do this, we first needed to develop a technique that would allow us to determine what proportion of the carbon in dissolved phase is actually pyrogenic. And determining the amount and distribution of pyrogenic carbon in soil, we can perhaps talk about this later, is an interesting exercise. Everybody has their own favorite method, and none of the methods are necessarily easy to transfer one-on-one, the findings from one method to the other. My personal favorite approach is nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR spectroscopy. Part of this, NMR is not necessarily an easy technique or even a quick technique, but I think it gives you a really useful tool to visualize what else, like the chemical fingerprint of the material, the leachate, or even the particulate matter you're talking about. So you're able to make, I think, a bit of a better estimation of the pyrogenic carbon in dissolved phase or in particulate phase. And then you're also then able to think carefully if that makes sense, considering the context, considering the other types of compounds that exist in soil. So just to situate you with what we're doing with these spectra, so this is what happens when we expose the soils to the high temperature in the furnace, and then we take them out, we take them through cold water extraction using ultra pure water. And then we freeze dry to remove all that water from the mixture, and then reconstitute the solution using dissolved DTO. So the deuterium here allows us to basically put the water peak in one line. Remember, in this case, we're working with proton NMR. So again, if you're going to try and kind of follow the proton in the mixture, then we have to be able to distinguish between the protons that are associated with water versus the protons that are associated with the organic compounds. So this allows us to put all the proton associated with water in this one narrow line so that we can subtract it from the spectra. Then we can go on separating the spectra based on the distribution of different types of organic functional group that we see. And in particular, I'm interested in this pool, this aromatic pool, because that is where I expect these condensed aromatic structures associated with high C to show up. So when we do this with all the soils that I mentioned earlier, then all the 5 soils, unburned samples versus exposed to 150, 250, and 350 degrees centigrades, we see a really interesting and rich data set that we get from this. And I know this is a lot for folks who are not used to it, so I'm just going to orient you to the blocks where the red stars are. And the main message that I want you to get from here is that when we expose soils to heat, at high temperature, starting 150 degrees C, we see clear evidence of dissolution and depolymerization of these larger organic compounds in dissolved organic matter. And part of this is associated with thermal decomposition of relatively simpler compounds such as carbohydrates and proteins in dissolved organic matter. We also clearly see increased contribution of dissolved pyrogenic matter in soils, in particular at high temperature at the 350 degrees C. To give you an example here, that soil that had the highest amount of carbon, it started out with leachate that had 3.1% of the carbon as being pyrogenic. But then after it's exposed to 350 degrees C, 75% of the carbon is pyrogenic, the remaining carbon that you could extract from that. And in particular, we noticed that high elevation soils tend to be more sensitive to thermal transformations at even more moderate temperatures compared to low temperature soils. Okay, so we established that carbon and pyrogenic carbon in particular can be mobilized. We figured out how aggregates are broken down at different type of fires, as well as the nature and amount of Pi-C you could expect in dissolved form. Then we needed to determine how about the lateral transport component. And for that, we moved on to the rim fire site, and we were fortunate to collaborate with folks at the National Park Service at Yosemite for this work. So just to orient you, this is the map on top is showing the green is the boundary of Yosemite National Park, and the different colors are showing how fast the fire moved when it was occurring in 2013. And we only stayed on the Yosemite side. We didn't work on the Stanislaus National Forest side. And a couple of things that are really important to remind you, the reason why we're doing this is that so when you go into that site immediately afterwards, like I showed you before, you have a lot of Pi-C that is on the surface. Some of it is big pieces, others are small. There's char, there's ash, a variety of things depending on the fire conditions. But you go on a few months after the fire, and you don't really see evidence of this Pi-C afterwards. And so we wanted to understand, okay, it's very clear that that Pi-C is getting transported. It's getting mobilized laterally. And so we were clear on the rapid loss part, but we're not clear on the effect that the type of fire and the intensity of fire has, as well as the slope of the landscape. So what is the dominant variable that governs how fast Pi-C is going to move from the ground surface? And to be able to do that, they used the burn severity map for the area, as well as the slope of that area. And we identified 21 spots that vary based on the fire severity as well as slope. So we wanted to have areas that were located for this monitoring in high severity burned areas at high slope, high severity burn areas at moderate slope, and moderate slope that was burned in high severity. So this is kind of the data, the table that shows you what's happening. For those statistically inclined folks here, I'm sure you've noticed that this is not a perfect statistical design, but that's what we had to work with in the burn area. So we just had to do the best that we can. And to be able to determine exactly how much material is moving and also what is the nature of the material that's moving, we took advantage of this relatively simple design, sediment fences, just the rebar and rubber that you could lay basically on the ground. You identify about 100-meter area around it, and you put it out. And after every major event, precipitation event, basically you go out, you clean it, you take samples, and you determine the mass of the sediment that was arrived in the sediment fence. And that gives you an idea of how much material was mobilized in these different treatment areas in the landscape. And when we do that, in the first year following the fire, we actually have data for 3 years, but I'm going to focus on the first year. On the first year after the fire, as soon as the precipitation starts, basically, you see a spike in the amount of sediment that's transported. Not surprised there, but what becomes really clear is that the amount of sediment transported from the high severity burn areas remains high in those two, especially major precipitation events on average. But generally speaking, the amount of sediment transported from the moderate severity burn area doesn't seem to change very much. And you also should, I think it's clear from the figures here, but note that I don't know why the slides are advancing by themselves. Apologize for that. I think I might have Anyway, so initially you see that this transport tends to be correlated, at least in the beginning, with when you have these high precipitation events. Okay, and then I'm going to do NMR again on the sediments that we collected from the sediment fences, but this time I'm going to do 13C solid state NMR. And this is a particular technique called cross-polarization magic angle spinning NMR, which basically allows me to use, to polarize the carbon using the proton, which is a way of just getting a relatively quicker spectra and data from carbon NMR without having to wait for direct polarization techniques that will trace the carbon. So when I do this, I get basically a fingerprint of the type of chemical organic compounds that are available in the soil. And I want you to keep track of, in particular, the peaks that show up about this middle zone here, marked by green here. These are the O and N substituted alkyls, so the simpler compounds like as carbohydrates, proteins, and the like. So fresh vegetation from foliage and the like would show up in this region. But aromatic compounds, in particular pyrogenic carbon, but also lignin, would show up in this mid region here, starting from about 130 or so in this chemical shift region. And I'm going to use these two colors again on the data that show you so that we keep track of relatively not fresh, not burned carbon versus the fire altered or transformed pyrogenic carbon. And initially, I want you to just focus on the top spectra from all these three groups. So these three groups are the same with what I showed you before: high severity, high burn, high severity, medium slope, high severity, high slope, high severity, medium slope, and medium severity, high slope. So both, across all these landscape, you see the high, kind of one of the highest peaks is this aromatic peak that's associated with pyrogenic carbon. But when you are in the medium severity burn area, you have a nice dominating peak associated with lipids, as well as a decent sized peak associated with those O and N substituted alkyls that I mentioned. So remember that these saturated and substituted alkyls are characteristic features of new, fresh organic matter, kind of like foliage and vegetation. And considering that this is, kind of a pine forest that's burned, and pines are known to shed needles after fires, this is not surprising that you have a decent amount of this relatively fresh carbon. But notice that peak associated with aromatic carbon, that star with red, it's a dominant feature in particular in the high severity burn areas. And then when I follow through the sediment that's transported from these sites, right? The top is the topsoil immediately after the fire. And then these two bottom ones are showing sediments that are transported in the beginning of that season, as well as the end of that season when it comes to sediment transport. In both cases, especially in the high severity burn area, it's very clear that the aromatic components are dominating basically the pool of carbon. But in the medium severity burn area, yes, you do have a lot of aromatic carbon that showed up in this peak, but you still end up with a decent amount of carbon from other pools. In fact, late in the season, we even see input of fresh organic matter associated with rather new entities. So the message here is that the eroded carbon is dominantly made out of these pyrogenic carbon. And in fact, when I do a stable isotope analysis of the transported material, I get very similar information, basically, that regardless of this slope of the landscape, the high severity burn areas always have this enriched signature of 15N that's associated with pyrogenic matter. Okay, so because I'm interested in post-fire Pi-C and its fate, I want to give you 3 specific lines of evidence to show why Pi-C is selectively transported, and that this might have an implication for how it's decomposed or its biological and environmental fate. To start with, when I plug the data that I got from the NMR in a molecular mixing model that allows me to determine what proportion of that carbon is actually pyrogenic, this is one of the superior qualities of the NMR technique that I like. When I do that, I notice that immediately after the fire, the carbon in topsoil is anywhere from about 35 to 55% pyrogenic. Remember that number I mentioned earlier in the beginning that some studies have shown up to 60% can be pyrogenic post-fire in topsoil. So this kind of agrees. Then you see a very clear separation in the data that we got from the high severity burn areas, regardless of slope of the landscape, versus the medium severity burn areas, right? So we see clear evidence of large amounts of pyrogenic carbon that's selectively transported. My colleague, Kerry Masiello at Rice University has also done a lot of experiments to show that when PyC is exposed to water, it tends to float because it's light. Its density can be somewhere between 0.25 to about 0.6 grams in particular before it gets wet, and hence it floats and becomes easy to transport. And my student Rebecca had more data to show that in paper that I don't think I'll get a lot of time to discuss today, but just to highlight to you all, this has important environmental fate, because what that means is depending on whether that PyC is transported into depositional environments, for example, from hill slopes, versus if it stays atop of the hill slope, it decomposes at very, very different rates. So it decomposes rather slowly if it stays in the hill slopes, which are technically more or less well drained and have lower nutrient availability and lower microbial activity than if it was to decompose in depositional settings such as floodplains and similar areas that tend to have high nutrient availability. They tend to stay wet longer, and they also have high microbial activity. So you see clear evidence basically on this fairly long-term incubation that we did. And then in conclusion, I want to show you that, so basically if you put the data that we got and so a lot of the understanding that was built in the studies that I showed in a kind of first order kinetic model for carbon dynamics in soil based on a well-established technique for carbon overall in soil, but this time we're just focusing on PyC. What we find is that obviously over long periods of time, if a site assume it's a flat area that only loses PyC based on biological, oxidative decay, or decomposition, then the amount of PyC it retains is going to be very different than if we consider a hill slope that is experiencing biological decomposition plus loss of some of that PyC by erosion, versus a depositional position in a hill slope that experiences biological deposition plus gain of PyC, of that eroded PyC that is now deposited downhill. So these are basically simulating the accumulation of the PyC in 3 distinct locations in the landscape. The dark black one is flat. The top one is a depositional position. So basically we're talking about a floodplain, a colluvial plain, or some depositional environment basically where eroded PyC is deposited. And then the top one is an eroded position. And the reason why we bothered to go this far to explain and quantify carbon dynamics over time is because we wanted to understand, so does this matter for how we estimate turnover rate and mean residence time of pyrogenic carbon? Indeed, it tends to have huge implications, because if we only assume based on this data and these types of modeling assumptions in these models, if we only assume that PyC is only experiencing decomposition and that's how it's lost, this is in fact the dominant way that PyC is modeled in soil these days, then we get a mean residence time that's somewhere between 250 to 300. But if we factor in erosional transport versus deposition of eroded material in this picture, we get quite a divergence of the mean residence time estimates for PyC, depending on what proportion of the PyC post-fire we think is getting eroded and transported by erosion. And that divergence, that error term basically that we're introducing in our estimates of mean residence time, can be somewhere between 75 and 100 years. And when you have a PyC estimate that's between 250, 300, that's an error that's equivalent to a third of the value that you're estimating. And so that's huge. So we have argued that erosion is an important variable that has to be included in how we model and understand PyC dynamics. So I hope what I've convinced you is that there are interesting and different mechanisms by which erosion is happening at low and high severity burned areas, and that fire severity in particular is a primary controlling variable for transport of organic matter and PyC sea, both in dissolved and particulate forms. And we conclude that the hydrologic interactions of Pi-C post-fire, in fact, are the primary variables driving its dynamics, owing to its low density and presence right on top of the soil surface without mineral association after fires. And we just published this commentary with my colleague Carrie Masiello that I mentioned at Rice, that basically concludes that the first interactions of Pi-C with the hydrologic cycle, they occur at the timescales of days to weeks after it's introduced to soil, in particular in wildfire conditions, and hence this supersedes microbial decomposition as a primary variable that controls its persistence in the soil system. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few questions here, and I'll read them out from the Q&A box. The first question from Rob asks or mentions, have you been able to do similar studies in areas that have had controlled burns or light fires? Wondering if the results are beneficial, that is, could be used to further support controlled burning.
So we have a study now that we're launching at the Kings River Experimental Watershed in South Sierra. This is an area, in fact, interestingly enough, when we did the work at the Rim Fire, we wrote the proposal with the goal of doing it at the Kings River Experimental Watershed, but that burn, which were prescribed burns, were delayed for like 7 years or something because of environmental issues and discussions of Forest Service with community members. So we were forced to move our study to Rim Fire when it happened in the middle. Anyway, that burn happened a few years ago now, and so we're following it in collaboration with folks at Forest Service PSW right now. I don't have any data like this to show you, other than to say that preliminary data that we've done in these prescribed burn areas show that indeed, they're happening at a lower temperature burns, right? So they tend to have less of an impact from an erosion perspective, at least not right away, compared to what we get with high severity burn areas. But that really depends on some of the burn conditions, because remember, they try to do prescribed burns when the soils are not bone dry, right? For controlling reasons, which means there's a bit of moisture in the soil when they do the prescribed burns. And that actually tends, there's a bit of worry right now with what we're learning with the physics of aggregate breakdown with this vapor pressure buildup that I mentioned, that it could cause disaggregation and erosion generation. I'll have an answer to your question, hopefully in a year or so. But generally speaking, I think what we're learning is low severity fires tend to be, from everything that we know, they're not obviously as destructive to the forest, and they also tend to be helpful in carbon buildup in the long term. But there's a lot of gaps in that, obviously, that folks are still working on.
Thank you. We have another question. Maria asks, what are the most important criteria for selecting sites for collecting samples, and how would you identify new relevant prospective sites?
So we were really interested in transport, right? And so we wanted to make sure we were, locating the study in areas that will fulfill the conditions for the questions we were asking. So we wanted areas that were variable in terms of fire severity, areas that were also located in different slopes, because we know fire severity and slope or geomorphology of the landscape are going to be important in dictating transport. When you do soil erosion work, basically, you know that the most important variables have to do with erosivity of the precipitation as well, or wind, and erodibility of the land, which is a function of slope of the landscape, length of the slope, vegetation cover, and management practices. So we used that as a guide for basically how to identify these sites. I think if we were to do this kind of work again, I would look for similar conditions, but probably under slightly different land uses and slope conditions as much as possible. Because again, we're constrained by where we can go based on where the fire happened in this case. So we chose the best possible combination of sites. But if you had your choice, obviously you wouldn't just choose 2 high and low severity areas. You would choose a range of severities and a range of slope conditions that would allow you to see if there's a linear relationship with slope or severity or things like that. But then again, I think it's important to be realistic when you're working in these kinds of sites, because you're constrained by the environment of where you could go. And so there's a bit of a matching happening between the question and the sites and what are the best questions you can ask in a specific site.
Thank you. We're actually all out of time for questions in this session, but remember that we have an extended hour of discussion, and we have the link to that Zoom meeting on the chat right now. But for now, join me in virtually thanking Dr. Berhe for such an interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll leave this meeting.